There are silences in history that feel heavier than sound, moments when the record breaks, when the clay grows cold, when something ends without explanation. In the ruins of ancient Sumer, beneath layers of sand and forgotten time, there are tablets that speak of such a moment. They speak of war, not the wars of men fighting over borders or kings claiming thrones, but something else, something that came before, a war among those who were remembered as gods. What really happened during the final Anunnaki war? The question sits quietly in the fragments. It waits in the broken edges of cuneiform script, in the stories that were never quite finished, in the names that appear and then vanish from the record. The Sumerians wrote of many things, of floods and kings, of cities built and cities abandoned, of harvests and rituals and the movements of stars. But threaded through their oldest writings, there are references to conflict, to a time when the Anunnaki, those distant figures who had shaped the world, turned against one another, when the earth itself may have trembled beneath decisions made by beings humanity could barely comprehend. Perhaps it was not war as we understand it. Perhaps there were no armies marching, no swords raised, no blood spilled across battlefields. Or perhaps there were all these things, but the memory of them was translated into language that could not fully capture what occurred. The Sumerians had words for many things, but how do you describe a conflict between those you believe created the very ground you stand upon? How do you record the unrecordable? The tablets suggest divisions. They speak of Enlil and Enki, of territories assigned and boundaries drawn, of councils convened and decisions disputed. These were not equals in the way humans are equals. They were remembered as those who commanded winds and waters, who held the tablets of destiny, who knew the secrets of life and death. And yet, somewhere in the deep past, they fractured. The unity, if it ever truly existed, broke apart. In the city of Nippur, fragments tell of tensions over kingship, over who would rule, and how, and why. Enlil, stern and unyielding, keeper of the bond between heaven and earth. Enki, wise and subtle, lord of the deep waters and hidden knowledge. Brothers, perhaps, or rivals, certainly. The texts are careful, reverent even in their descriptions of conflict, but the conflict is there. Beneath the ritual language and the hymns of praise, there is disagreement, there is struggle. Perhaps it began slowly, small disputes over jurisdiction, over which of the Anunnaki would govern which aspect of the world humanity was building. Enki in the Abzu, the freshwater depths beneath the earth. Enlil in the highlands, where storms were born. Inanna, fierce and unpredictable, claiming her own domain. Ninhursag, mother of life, withdrawn and watchful, each with their sphere, each with their purpose, and yet the boundaries were never quite clear enough. The roles were never quite settled, or perhaps it began with humanity itself. The texts whisper of a time when the Anunnaki grew weary, when the labor of maintaining the world, of shaping civilization, of teaching and guiding and watching over the growing human cities became too much. There are fragments that speak of rebellion among lesser Anunnaki, those who toiled while the great ones deliberated, stories of burdens too heavy to carry, of work without end, of a decision made to create workers, humanity, to ease that burden. But if humanity was created to serve, what happened when humanity began to thrive on its own? When the cities grew larger, when the kings became powerful, when the human world no longer needed constant guidance? Did the Anunnaki see this as success or as threat? Did they celebrate what they had made, or did they fear it? The tablets from Eridu, that most ancient of cities, carry echoes of these questions. They speak of Enki's fondness for humanity, his protection of them, his willingness to share knowledge that perhaps should have remained hidden. They speak of Enlil's frustration, his sense that boundaries had been crossed, that the natural order had been disturbed. Two different visions of what humanity should be, two different understandings of the relationship between the creators and the created. And from this fundamental disagreement, perhaps everything else followed. There is a text, fragmentary and weathered, that describes a gathering, a council of the Anunnaki convened to decide the fate of humanity. The occasion is not entirely clear. The tablet is broken, the context lost, but the tension is unmistakable. Enlil speaks of ending what has begun, of returning the world to silence. Enki speaks of preservation, of the value in what has been made, of potential not yet realized. The other Anunnaki listen, choose sides, align themselves with one vision or the other. This may have been the beginning of the final war, not a sudden eruption of violence, but a slow divergence of purpose that could no longer be reconciled, a philosophical divide that became a cosmic one. In the Epic of Atrahasis, there are hints of what came next, a decision made to reduce humanity, to limit its expansion, to remind it of its place. Disease is sent, famine follows. The earth is made harsh, but the harvests fail, the cities suffer, but humanity endures. It adapts, it survives, it continues to grow. And with each failure to contain it, the divisions among the Anunnaki deepen. Enlil, frustrated by humanity's resilience, by Enki's continued protection, makes a final decision. If humanity will not be limited, it will be ended. The great flood is decreed. The waters will rise, the world will be cleansed, and from the silence, a new beginning can emerge, clean, ordered, controlled. But Enki defies this decree. The tablets are clear on this point, even if they are unclear on so much else. Enki warns Atrahasis, or Ziusudra in some versions, Utnapishtim in others. He provides instructions for survival. A boat is built, a remnant is saved, and when the waters recede, humanity remains. This was not merely disobedience. This was cosmic rebellion. One of the great Anunnaki directly contradicting the will of another. The unity of the divine council, if it had ever truly existed, was shattered beyond repair. Perhaps the flood itself was the war. Perhaps the rising waters were not just punishment for humanity, but weapon and battleground in a conflict between Enlil and Enki, between those who would end the human experiment and those who would preserve it. The Sumerian texts do not describe it this way explicitly, but the echoes are there. The sense of something vast and terrible, of powers in opposition, of a world caught between incompatible wills. And when the waters fell, when the earth emerged again, and humanity began to rebuild, the Anunnaki were changed. The tablets from the post-flood period speak of them differently, more distant, less involved, as if something had broken that could not be repaired. In the silence after the waters, there are texts that describe a reckoning. The Anunnaki did not simply return to their former roles, did not resume the patterns that had governed the world before. Something fundamental had shifted. Enlil's authority once absolute, was now questioned. Enki's defiance, once unthinkable, had become reality. The other Anunnaki, Ninhursag, Inanna, Utu, Nana, the countless lesser ones whose names appear and fade in the records, all had to choose how to navigate this new reality. Perhaps there were confrontations we can only glimpse in fragments, references to disputes over sovereignty, to Enlil's anger that would not abate, to councils where accusations were made and justifications offered. The tablets speak in the language of myth, of gods debating in distant heavens, but beneath the poetic imagery there may be memory of something real, something that happened. In the city of Lagash, there are cylinder seals that depict strange scenes, figures that appear divine in scale and bearing, positioned not in cooperation, but in opposition. Weapons raised, though not against humans, celestial boats moving in different directions. Symbols of different Anunnaki placed at odds rather than in harmony. These are not scenes of worship or celebration. They are scenes of division. The texts become more fragmented here, as if the scribes themselves were uncertain how to record what they had inherited. There are lists of the Anunnaki that change from city to city, from era to era. Names that appear prominently in one location are absent in another, as if different cities remember different outcomes, different allegiances, different versions of what occurred. Nippur remembered Enlil as supreme even after the flood. The cult of Enlil remained strong there. The temple of Akur maintained its central importance, and the rituals continued to acknowledge his lordship over the bond between heaven and earth. But there is a defensiveness in these later texts, a need to assert what perhaps was no longer taken for granted. They proclaim Enlil's authority with an insistence that earlier texts did not require. Eridu remembered Enki as the preserver, the wise one, the protector of humanity and keeper of sacred knowledge. The temple of Eabzu continued to honor him, and the priests there maintained traditions that spoke of his primacy in creation, his role in establishing order from chaos. But Eridu was declining by the time these later texts were written. Its influence was waning, its glory fading into the past, as if the city itself was a remnant of a worldview that no longer held sway. Perhaps the final war was not a single battle, but a slow dissolution, a gradual separation of the Anunnaki into factions that no longer communicated, no longer coordinated, no longer shared a common purpose, each withdrawing to their own domain, their own city, their own sphere of influence, until the unified presence they had once maintained was fractured beyond recognition. There are references in the texts to Anunnaki departing, not dying. The concept of divine death is handled carefully and rarely in Sumerian literature, but leaving, returning to somewhere else. The term used is sometimes heaven, sometimes the mountain, sometimes simply away, as if there were places the Anunnaki could go that humans could not follow, could not even properly conceive of. Did they leave because the war made the earth uninhabitable for them, because the energy required to maintain their presence, to continue their involvement in human affairs, was no longer worth expending, or because the conflict among them had made cooperation impossible, and without cooperation, their entire purpose here had become meaningless? Inanna's texts are particularly telling in this regard. The descent of Inanna, one of the most complete myths we possess, describes her journey to the underworld, to the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal. She descends through 7 gates, removing aspects of her power at each one until she stands naked and powerless before the throne of the dead. And there she is killed, hung on a hook like meat, left to rot. She returns eventually through Enki's intervention, always Enki, the preserver, the one who will not let even the gods perish entirely. But she does not return unchanged. She must provide a substitute to take her place in the underworld. She chooses Dumuzi, her consort, and he is dragged down to fill the void she left. Perhaps this myth carries memory of the cost of the final war, that the Anunnaki could fight, could descend into conflict with one another, but the price was transformation, diminishment, a loss of the fullness they had once possessed. Inanna returns from death, but she returns lesser. She returns changed, and someone else must pay the price for her survival. The texts from Uruk, Inanna's city, grow strange in the later periods. They speak of her with continued reverence, but also with a kind of bewilderment, as if she has become unpredictable, dangerous in new ways, no longer quite the figure she had been. Her festivals take on darker tones. Her myths emphasize her violence, her sexuality, her capacity for destruction, alongside her capacity for blessing. She is both more and less than she was. A goddess who survived something that perhaps she should not have. And Dumuzi, the shepherd king, becomes a figure of annual death and return. Not truly alive, not truly dead, but cycling between states, a god diminished to the point of being almost mortal, almost human, caught in a pattern of suffering that the earlier Anunnaki had never known. Perhaps they all became this way in the end, caught between states, no longer fully present, no longer fully powerful, but not entirely absent either. The texts from the later Sumerian period, from the Akkadian Empire and beyond, speak of the Anunnaki in increasingly distant terms. They are invoked, praised, offered sacrifices, but they do not speak back with the clarity they once did. They do not intervene with the directness they once possessed. There are astronomical texts from this period that track the movements of celestial bodies with extraordinary precision. Venus, Jupiter, Mars, all carefully observed and recorded, but the language used to describe them shifts. Earlier texts spoke of these celestial bodies as the Anunnaki themselves, as gods moving through the heavens. Later texts speak of them as signs of divine will, as messages from gods who are elsewhere. The distinction is subtle but crucial. The gods are no longer identical with the phenomena. They are behind them, beyond them, communicating through them rather than being them. This may be what the final war accomplished, a separation of the Anunnaki from the physical world they had once inhabited so completely. They became symbolic rather than present, conceptual rather than tangible, and humanity was left to interpret their will through signs and omens rather than through direct encounter. But there are texts that suggest not all the Anunnaki departed peacefully. References to conflicts that continued even after the Great Flood, even after the primary schism between Enlil and Enki. Stories of wars between cities that were not merely human wars, but reflections of divine conflicts, Ur against Uruk, Lagash against Uma, Kish against Akkad, each claiming the favor of different Anunnaki, each fighting proxy battles for gods who would not or could not fight directly any longer. The curse of Akkad is particularly vivid in this regard. It describes how Naram Sin, king of Akkad, destroyed the Ekur and Lil's temple in Nippur, an act of supreme sacrilege, a violation of the most sacred space in Sumer. And for this, Enlil brings destruction upon Akkad. Not directly, the text is clear that Enlil does not descend to smash the city himself. Instead, he withdraws his protection. He allows the Gutians, wild peoples from the mountains, to sweep down and devastate the land. This is war by absence, war by withdrawal. The Anunnaki are no longer fighting each other with cosmic weapons or divine power. They are fighting by removing themselves, by ceasing to maintain the order they had once guaranteed. And in that absence, chaos rushes in. Perhaps this was the true nature of the final war. Not a spectacular battle with the heavens torn open and the earth shattered, but a slow retreat, a gradual abandonment. The Anunnaki withdrawing step by step, city by city, generation by generation, until they were gone entirely. And the war was simply the process of deciding who would leave first, who would stay longest, who would maintain the final threads of connection to the world they had made. The texts from the Ur-Thurs period, that last great flowering of Sumerian culture, are filled with elaborate rituals designed to maintain divine presence. Temples are built with extraordinary care. Priesthoods are established with precise hierarchies. Offerings are calculated down to the smallest detail, as if humanity sensed that the gods were slipping away and was desperately trying to hold them in place through sheer devotion, through perfect performance of sacred duty. But it did not work. The rituals continued, but the presence they were meant to invoke grew fainter. The temples stood, but they became houses for memory rather than dwelling places for living gods. There is a tablet from Ur, badly damaged, that lists the Anunnaki who once judged the fates of men. 50 names, perhaps more, the edges broken, the clay crumbled to fragments. But what remains is telling. Next to each name, there should be a title, a function, a domain of authority. In the oldest copies of such lists, these titles are present and clear. Each Anunnaki has their role defined, their purpose stated, their place in the cosmic order made explicit. But in this later tablet, many of the spaces are empty. The names are there, carefully inscribed, but the functions are missing, as if the scribe no longer knew what these Anunnaki did, as if the knowledge had already been lost, or as if the Anunnaki themselves no longer performed the roles they once had, and to claim otherwise would be to lie. Perhaps this is what the final war took from the world, not lives. The Anunnaki do not die in the way humans die, but purpose, the clear definition of roles, the understood hierarchy, the agreed-upon order that had allowed civilization to function. When Enlil and Enki turned against each other, when the council fractured, when each Anunnaki began to pursue their own vision rather than a shared one, the entire structure came undone. The legal texts from this period are fascinating in their desperation. They attempt to establish order through human authority, through kings claiming divine sanction, through law codes that invoke the names of the Anunnaki, but do not wait for their direct input. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest law codes we possess, begins with a claim that the king has been chosen by the gods to establish justice. But the laws themselves are human determinations. They do not record divine pronouncements. They are what humans decided was necessary in the absence of clear divine guidance. This is new. In earlier periods, justice was understood to flow from the Anunnaki themselves. Kings were executors of divine will, not originators of law. But now, the kings must generate the law themselves and merely seek divine approval after the fact. The gods have stepped back, and the space they left must be filled with something. Perhaps the Anunnaki intended this. Perhaps the final war was also a final test, a final teaching. They withdrew to see if humanity could govern itself, could maintain order without their constant intervention. If civilization could endure when the civilizers departed, or perhaps they simply had no choice. Perhaps the conflict exhausted them, drained them of whatever energy or essence allowed them to remain present in the physical world. Perhaps they retreated not by decision, but by necessity, withdrawn into whatever realm they had come from, because they could no longer sustain themselves here. The hymns from the end of the Third period have a quality of mourning to them. They praise the Anunnaki with increasing eloquence, but the praise feels elegiac. They are celebrating what was, not what is. The temple hymns of Enheduanna, high priestess of Ur, describe the great temples of Sumer with extraordinary detail and beauty, but they describe them as containers for divine presence, not as places where the gods actively dwell. The temples are praised for their construction, their decoration, their ritual purity, all things humans create and maintain. The gods themselves are invoked but distant, honored but not quite present. Enheduanna's personal hymns to Inanna are even more revealing. She speaks to the goddess with desperate intimacy, pleading for attention, for intervention, for acknowledgement. She has been cast out of her position, exiled from the temple, and she calls to Inanna to restore her. And Inanna does, eventually, in the narrative of the hymn. But the tone is one of uncertainty, of a relationship that is no longer reliable. The goddess might help or might not. She might hear or might be too far away to notice. This is not how the early Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki. In the earliest texts, there is confidence. The gods are there, watching, responding, shaping events with clear intention. But by Enheduanna's time, that confidence has eroded. The gods might still act, but they might not. They might still care, but their care is no longer guaranteed. Perhaps the final war ended not with a victor, but with exhaustion. All sides depleted, all purposes compromised, all relationships broken beyond repair. And in that exhaustion, a mutual withdrawal, an agreement, silent and unspoken, that the time of direct divine involvement in the world had passed, that whatever the Anunnaki had come to accomplish was finished or had failed or had reached a natural conclusion that made their continued presence unnecessary. There are texts that speak of a transfer of power. The ME, those fundamental principles or divine attributes that governed reality, are described as being passed from one Anunnaki to another, or from the Anunnaki to human kings, or lost entirely in moments of chaos. Inanna's acquisition of the ME from Enki is one of the most famous stories. She tricks him while he is drunk, steals the divine powers, and flees to Uruk before he can reclaim them. The story is often read as a myth of Inanna's cleverness, of the transfer of cultural authority from Eridu to Uruk, but perhaps it also carries memory of a deeper truth, that the ME were no longer held securely by the Anunnaki, that they could be lost, stolen, transferred, scattered, that the fundamental order of reality was becoming unstable as the gods who had maintained it began to fail. And if the ME could be lost by one Anunnaki, they could be lost by all of them. The tablets hint at this possibility. References to me that have vanished, to powers that no longer function as they once did, to aspects of reality that have become unpredictable or uncontrollable. As if the war had damaged not just the relationships between the Anunnaki, but the fabric of existence itself. There are fragmentary references to weapons used in divine conflicts, not physical weapons, though those appear in some texts, but something else. The word of Enlil that could destroy cities. The net of Enki that could trap even gods. The brilliance of Inanna that overwhelmed all who beheld it. These are not described in detail, as if the scribes either did not fully understand them or were forbidden from recording them too explicitly, but they suggest that the Anunnaki possessed capacities that went beyond the merely physical, that their conflicts operated on levels humans could barely perceive, let alone comprehend. When they fought, perhaps reality itself was the battlefield. The structures of existence, the patterns of nature, the fundamental laws that governed the cosmos, all of these might have been weapons and targets simultaneously. And if so, what did their war do to the world? What scars did it leave that we can no longer even recognize as scars because we have never known anything else? Perhaps the world we inhabit is already the damaged version, the compromised reality that emerged from divine conflict, and we have no reference point for what it was before. The astronomical texts track irregularities, movements of celestial bodies that do not quite match the expected patterns. The scribes record these carefully, trying to understand what they mean, what messages the gods are sending through these deviations. But perhaps they are not messages. Perhaps they are damage, tears in the fabric of celestial order that the Anunnaki can no longer repair because they are no longer present or no longer unified enough to coordinate such repairs. The flood myths appear in multiple cultures, not just in Sumer, Akkadian versions, Babylonian versions, eventually Hebrew versions that will become the story of Noah. The details shift, the names change, but the core remains consistent. A decision to destroy humanity, a warning given in secret, a remnant preserved, waters that cover the world, and afterward, a changed relationship between divine and human. Perhaps this story spread because it recorded something real, not necessarily a literal global flood, though the Persian Gulf region did experience catastrophic flooding in the deep past, but a moment of cosmic rupture, a point where the Anunnaki's unity shattered and their war became impossible to hide from humanity. The flood as metaphor for overwhelming change, for a world drowned in conflict and emerging transformed. After the flood, the texts say, the Anunnaki granted kingship to humanity, formal, explicit kingship, with kings listed by name and their reigns carefully recorded. Before the flood, the king lists speak of impossibly long reigns, of rulers who lived for thousands or tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the reigns become more reasonable, more human in scale. Perhaps this marks the transition. Before the war's conclusion, human rulers were closely guided by the Anunnaki, perhaps even partially merged with them, sustained by divine power in ways that extended their lives beyond natural limits. After the war, Humans were truly on their own. The kings lived human lifespans, ruled with human wisdom, and when they died, they stayed dead. The Anunnaki no longer invested themselves in human leaders the way they once had. The ziggurat temples that arose in this period are architecturally fascinating. Massive stepped platforms lifting toward the sky with small shrines at their peaks. They are often interpreted as stairways for the gods, structures built to make it easier for the Anunnaki to descend from heaven to earth. But perhaps they were the opposite. Perhaps they were humanity's attempt to reach upward toward gods who were receding. Though Anunnaki were no longer coming down, so humans built towers to climb up. Desperate architecture reaching toward beings who were slipping away. The texts from Babylon, rising in power as Sumer faded, tell the story differently. The Enuma Elish, their creation epic, describes conflicts among gods, but places them at the beginning of time, not the end. Tiamat and Apsu, primordial waters, giving birth to younger gods who make too much noise, who disturb the ancient peace. The elders decide to destroy their children. The children fight back. Marduk, young and ambitious, defeats Tiamat and from her corpse creates the world. This is presented as cosmogony, as the explanation for how reality came to be. But perhaps it is also memory rearranged. Perhaps the Babylonians inherited the Sumerian stories of divine conflict and, not understanding their true placement in time, moved them to the beginning, turned the final war into the first war, made the end into the origin, or perhaps both versions are true simultaneously. Perhaps the Anunnaki's conflicts were cyclical, repeating patterns that occurred at the beginning and the end and possibly many times in between. Perhaps they fought, reconciled, and fought again, generation after generation of gods, until finally the pattern broke and could not be restored. The Babylonian texts give Marduk supremacy over the other gods. They describe how he assumed the powers of Enlil, how he took on the roles of Enki, how he became the center around which all other deities orbited. But this ascension is described as political, almost bureaucratic. The older gods gather in assembly and vote to grant Marduk supreme authority. They do not do this willingly, but because they need him, because Tiamat threatens them all, and only Marduk is willing and able to face her. Perhaps this records the end of the Anunnaki's war. Not a clear victory by one side, but a desperate compromise. The conflicts had become so destructive, so threatening to the very foundations of existence, that a new arrangement had to be made. One god, or one faction, had to be elevated above all others, given absolute authority in order to end the chaos, and the others had to accept this diminishment of their own power, because the alternative was complete annihilation. Marduk in Babylon, Ashur in Assyria, eventually Yahweh among the Hebrews, each culture taking the pattern and filling it with their own preferred deity, one god rising to supremacy while the others fade into subordinate roles or vanish entirely from the record, not because this is how it always was, but because this is how it had to become in order for divine order to be restored after the war tore it apart. But the older gods do not disappear immediately, even in these later traditions. They linger at the edges. Ea, the Babylonian name for Enki, continues to be invoked for wisdom and magic. Ishtar, the Akkadian Inanna, remains powerful and dangerous. The ancient names persist, But their independence is gone. They serve Marduk now. They function within his cosmic order, not their own. Perhaps this was the price of peace. The Anunnaki who survived the final war had to accept subordination to a new hierarchy. They had to surrender their autonomy, their separate spheres of influence, their individual wills. Unity would be imposed from above, by force if necessary, because the alternative, continued conflict, had proven too destructive to tolerate. And those who would not accept this arrangement, the texts are silent on their fate, or nearly so. There are hints of gods imprisoned, bound, sealed away in the earth or in distant heavens. The Igigi, lesser Anunnaki who rebelled, are sometimes described as being consigned to hard labor, to punishment, to exile. Perhaps these are the ones who refused the new order, who would not bend, who were broken instead. In the Greek traditions, much later, there are echoes of this pattern. The Titans, older gods, overthrown and imprisoned in Tartarus by the younger Olympians. The war between generations of deities, the victory of the new over the old, the binding of the defeated in places of darkness. Perhaps the Greeks inherited fragments of the same stories that the Sumerians recorded. Perhaps this pattern of divine warfare and succession appeared in many cultures because it reflected something real, something that happened and was remembered, however imperfectly, across vast distances and centuries. The Jewish texts take the pattern further. Yahweh stands alone, supreme, and unchallenged. The other gods are reduced to angels, servants with no independent will, or to demons, rebellious beings who have been cast down and stripped of power. The heavenly court remains, but it is no longer a council of equals or near equals. It is a hierarchy with one absolute authority at its peak. Perhaps this is the final form of what the Anunnaki's war set in motion. The slow consolidation of divine power into fewer and fewer hands until only one remains. Not because this is theologically correct, but because this is how the conflict resolved itself over centuries. The multiplicity could not hold. The competing wills, the divided loyalties, the separate visions of how reality should be ordered, all of this proved unsustainable, and so the many became few, and the few became one, and the one demanded absolute obedience. But even in monotheism, traces of the older pattern remain. The angels who fell, the divine council that still exists, even if it no longer decides. The names of God that are plural, Elohim, suggesting multiplicity hidden within singularity. The texts try to erase the evidence of what came before, but they cannot do it completely. The memory persists in fragments, in contradictions, in stories that do not quite fit the official narrative. The Sumerian texts do not reach this conclusion. They end before monotheism emerges, while the Anunnaki are still multiple, even if they are also fading. But the trajectory is already visible. Each generation of texts describes fewer active gods. More of them are distant, silent, reduced to names in lists rather than characters in stories. The living pantheon is contracting. There are texts that describe the Anunnaki withdrawing to the stars, not metaphorically, but as if they physically departed the earth and took up residence in the heavens. Each major deity associated with a celestial body. Inanna with Venus, Nana with the moon, Utu with the sun, Enlil with the Pleiades perhaps, or with the storms that move beneath them, Enki with the waters that reflect the stars. Did they withdraw there at the war's conclusion? did they partition the cosmos into spheres of influence, agreeing that separation was the only way to prevent further conflict? You take the heavens, I will take the earth. You govern the night, I will govern the day. Borders drawn not across lands, but across reality itself, with the physical distance of astronomical bodies, ensuring they would never again come into direct contact. If so, their war ended not with reconciliation, but with divorce, a permanent separation enforced by the structure of the cosmos itself. And humanity, left on the earth, could look up and see them scattered across the sky, present but unreachable, watching but no longer intervening, their light falling on the world, but their substance gone. The astrologers who emerged in Babylon and spread across the ancient world claimed to read divine will in the movements of celestial bodies. The position of Venus indicated Ishtar's favor or disfavor. Lunar eclipses warned of danger. Planetary alignments signaled shifts in cosmic power. But perhaps they had it backward. Perhaps the celestial bodies did not carry messages. Perhaps they were the Anunnaki themselves, and their movements were not communication, but simply the continuation of their existence in the only form they could now maintain. Distant, silent, reduced to light and mathematics. This is what the war made them. There are calculations in the later texts, astronomical records of astonishing precision, tracking cycles that span centuries. The Babylonians could predict eclipses, map planetary orbits, identify recurring patterns in the sky with accuracy that would not be matched again for millennia. They did this by observation, by careful record keeping, by mathematical analysis. But perhaps they were also looking for something else, trying to find patterns in the movements of the Anunnaki, trying to understand the relationships between celestial bodies as echoes of the relationships between gods. If Venus approaches Mars, what does that mean about Ishtar and Nergal? If Jupiter aligns with Saturn, is that Marduk in accord with Ninurta or in opposition? The movements of the heavens as continuation of divine politics by other means. And if so, what did they see? Did the Anunnaki, even in their stellar forms, still contend with one another? Were conjunctions moments of cooperation or conflict? Did eclipses mark victories or defeats and struggles too vast and slow for human minds to fully comprehend? The texts do not say explicitly, but there is a sense in the astronomical omens that the heavens are not neutral, that the movements of celestial bodies have moral and political significance, that what happens in the sky affects what happens on earth, not because the gods are sending messages, but because the gods are still fighting, still competing, still unable to fully let go of the conflicts that divided them. And if the war never truly ended, if it merely transformed into something slower and more distant, then perhaps it continues still. Perhaps we live beneath skies that are battlegrounds, where conflicts older than human civilization play out on scales we can barely measure. The Anunnaki reduced to light and gravity, their weapons now orbital mechanics and stellar radiation, their battlefield the entire cosmos. This would explain why the texts become more desperate over time, why the rituals grow more elaborate, even as they become less effective. Humanity was trying to manage conflicts it could no longer understand, trying to maintain peace between gods who had become too vast and strange to properly worship. There is a genre of Sumerian literature that modern scholars call lamentation texts. They describe the destruction of cities, Nippur, Eridu, Lagash, in language of overwhelming grief. The cities are abandoned by their gods, the protective deities withdraw, and in their absence, enemies sweep in. Buildings are destroyed, populations scattered, the sacred precincts violated, and through it all, the laments ask the same question: why did the gods allow this? Why did they not protect what they had made? The answers given are always variations on divine will. The gods decreed it. The cosmic order demanded it. The assembly of the Anunnaki made their decision, and it could not be altered. But beneath this acceptance, there is bewilderment. These are prayers without hope of answer, grief without possibility of consolation. The gods have withdrawn and will not return, no matter how desperately they are called. Perhaps these laments preserve the human experience of the Anunnaki's final war. Not the divine perspective, not the cosmic significance, but what it felt like on the ground when the gods turned away, when protection was withdrawn, when cities that had stood for centuries under divine patronage suddenly found themselves alone. The war may have been fought in heavens or in councils beyond human comprehension, but its effects were immediate and devastating for those who depended on the Anunnaki's continued presence. The lamentation stowed over the destruction of is particularly vivid. It describes Nana, the moon god, patron of weeping for his city but unable to prevent its fall. He goes before the council of the great gods, before Enlil and the assembly, and pleads for to be spared. But the decree has been made. The decision is final. Even Nana in his own city cannot override the will of the collective. This is not the action of a unified pantheon working together for a shared purpose. This is the action of a fractured council where individual gods have lost the power to protect their own domains, where decisions are made by majority or by force, and dissent is overruled rather than accommodated. The Anunnaki are still present in this text, still active, but they are not in harmony. They are bound by decisions they do not all agree with, following decrees some of them mourn. Perhaps this was the late stage of the war, not open conflict anymore, but cold bureaucracy, councils that function but do not truly deliberate. Decisions made through power rather than consensus. Gods who attend assemblies but whose voices no longer matter, whose cities are sacrificed for purposes they cannot change or challenge. And then perhaps even this degraded form of divine governance collapsed. The councils stopped meeting. The assemblies were no longer convened. Each Anunnaki retreated fully into isolation, maintaining what little sphere of influence they still possessed, no longer attempting to coordinate with others who had become strangers or enemies. The cities that survived this transition were the ones that learned to function without expecting divine intervention. Babylon succeeded not because Marduk was more powerful than the older gods, but because Babylon's priesthood and kingship developed systems that did not require constant divine presence. They honored Marduk, built him temples, performed elaborate rituals, but they also created legal codes, administrative structures, military organizations that operated on human authority. The other cities, the ones that continued to wait for their gods to return, to protect, to guide, these cities faltered. Ur was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, each iteration weaker than the last. Nippur maintained its religious significance, but lost political power. Eridu was eventually abandoned entirely, its temples falling silent, its ancient wisdom lost or scattered. This might be the clearest evidence of what the final war accomplished. It made the Anunnaki irrelevant, not by destroying them, but by forcing them into such complete withdrawal that human civilization had to learn to function without them. And in learning that lesson, humanity discovered it no longer needed them. The gods became optional, honored perhaps, but not essential. There are texts from the Persian period, centuries after Sumer had fallen, that still invoke the Anunnaki. But the invocations are formulaic, traditional, performed because they had always been performed rather than because anyone expected a response. The gods had become cultural memory rather than living presence. Stories told to explain the past, not powers shaping the present. And yet, there are strange moments even in these late texts, references to dreams where the old gods appeared, omens that seem to follow ancient patterns, rituals that produced effects their performers could not quite explain, as if some thread of connection remained, however thin, as if the Anunnaki, even in their withdrawal, had not completely severed themselves from the world they had made. Perhaps they could not. Perhaps the bond between creator and creation is not something that can be fully broken, even by war, even by mutual decision to part. Perhaps that Anunnaki remain connected to Earth and humanity not by choice, but by the simple fact of having been here, having shaped this world, having invested themselves in its formation. They can withdraw, but they cannot entirely leave. They can fall silent, but they cannot become nothing. In the magical texts of the later periods, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, the Anunnaki are invoked in spells and incantations, not as gods to be worshipped, but as powers to be commanded. The magician calls on Enki or Ea to bind demons, on Ishtar to compel love, on the names of half-forgotten deities to achieve effects both miraculous and mundane. And the assumption in these texts is that the invocation will work, that speaking the names correctly, performing the ritual precisely, will compel the old gods to act, whether they wish to or not. This is a profound reversal. Once, humanity served the Anunnaki. Then, humanity functioned without them. And finally, humanity claimed to command them, to use their power for human purposes, to bind them with words and symbols, to reduce them to tools. Perhaps this was the final insult, the final injury of the war's aftermath. Not only did the Anunnaki lose their unity, their purpose, their clear relationship to the world they had made, they also lost their sovereignty. They became subject to human will, or at least to the will of those humans who knew the right words, the right gestures, the right offerings. Or perhaps this was always the plan. Perhaps the war was part of a long process of transfer. The Anunnaki raised humanity, taught it, guided it, and then withdrew so that humanity could mature. They fought among themselves to break their own unity, to prevent any single will from dominating, to ensure that what they left behind would not be a tyranny, but a multiplicity of possibilities. In this reading, the war was sacrifice. The Anunnaki destroyed their own cohesion, their own presence, their own power, in order to give humanity the space to become truly independent. They fought so that we would not have to serve. They scattered themselves across the cosmos so that we would inherit the earth. It is a generous reading, perhaps too generous. The texts do not really support it. The gods in the tablets do not seem to be sacrificing themselves willingly. They seem to be fighting for survival, for dominance, for the preservation of their individual wills against the wills of others. They seem to be losing, slowly and painfully, their grip on a world that is slipping away from them. But perhaps both things can be true. Perhaps the war was bitter and desperate and destructive and also necessary. Perhaps the Anunnaki did not intend to liberate humanity, but their conflict accomplished that liberation anyway. The universe often works through unintended consequences, through disasters that become opportunities, through destruction that makes space for new creation. The late Sumerian hymns have a quality of farewell to them. They praise the gods with beauty and precision, but there is finality in the language. These are songs for deities who are departing, or who have already departed, or who are fading so gradually that it is impossible to mark the exact moment of their absence. Inanna's hymns speak of her in the past tense, even when they address her directly. You who were the bright light of heaven, you who commanded the earth, you who held the hearts of all people in your hands. Were, not are, as if the priestess singing the hymn knows that Inanna is no longer what she once was, even if she cannot quite bring herself to state this plainly. The temple hymns describe structures maintained with meticulous care, but the care feels anticipatory. These are not temples for gods who dwell within them. Those are temples for gods who might return if the conditions are perfect, if the rituals are performed correctly, if humanity proves worthy. The temples are kept ready for a return that grows less likely with each passing generation, and eventually, even the maintenance falters. The temples are abandoned or converted to other purposes. The ziggurats crumble. The clay tablets are buried under centuries of dust and sand. The names of the Anunnaki are forgotten by the cultures that inherit the land, and new gods with new names take their places in the stories humanity tells itself. But the deeper patterns persist. The idea of gods who once walked the earth. The memory of a time when the divine was close, tangible, directly involved in human affairs. The sense that something was lost, that the world now is less than it once was, that we live in the shadow of a greater age. Every culture seems to have this memory, a golden age when gods and humans mingled, a fall that separated them, a present diminished by comparison to the past. Perhaps these are universal human longings, psychological patterns that every society generates independently. Or perhaps they are memories, inherited and transformed, of something that actually happened. The Anunnaki's war and its aftermath, echoing down through millennia, becoming myth and legend and eventually vague intuition. The Sumerian texts are the oldest we have, the closest to the source, and they speak clearly of conflict among those who were remembered as gods, of a unity broken, of presences that withdrew and did not return. What really happened during the final Anunnaki War? The question remains, suspended in the spaces between broken tablets and fragmentary hymns. Perhaps there was a moment of catastrophic conflict, powers clashing in ways that reshaped reality itself. Perhaps it was slower than that, a dissolution over centuries, councils that stopped meeting, gods who ceased to speak, presences that faded like stars at dawn. The Sumerian scribes preserved what they could. They pressed their memories into clay with careful hands, knowing perhaps that they were recording the end of something. Their words speak of divisions among the Anunnaki, of Enlil and Enki in opposition, of Inanna descending and returning changed, of cities abandoned by their protective deities, of waters that rose and fell and left the world transformed. Beneath the myth language, beneath the poetic imagery and the ritual formulas, there may be truth, not the literal truth of historical record. The Sumerians did not write history as we understand it, but the deeper truth of inherited memory. They remembered a time when the world was different, when those they called gods were present in ways they no longer were, when guidance came from beyond the human and humanity lived in relationship with something vast and strange. And they remembered when that relationship broke, when the gods turned against each other or turned away from the world, or simply could not maintain their presence any longer. The war may have been fought with weapons we cannot imagine, over stakes we cannot comprehend, but its result was clear. The Anunnaki departed. The direct divine governance of the world ended, so humanity was left alone. Perhaps we are still alone. Perhaps the gods scattered themselves so completely across the cosmos that they will never reassemble, never reunify, never return. Perhaps they watch from distances too vast to bridge, their conflicts still unresolved, their war continuing in forms we can no longer perceive. Or perhaps they finished what they came to do. Perhaps they raised humanity to the point where our continued development required their absence. Perhaps the war was the final lesson, that we could not remain children forever, that we had to learn to walk without their hands guiding us, even if that meant watching them tear themselves apart in the process of letting go. The tablets do not tell us which is true. They only tell us that something ended, that the age of the Anunnaki passed into the age of humanity, that the gods who shaped the first cities withdrew into silence and distance, leaving only their names, their stories, and the lingering question of why. We build our civilizations now without them. We chart our own courses, make our own laws, face our own chaos without divine intervention. Whether this is abandonment or liberation, curse or gift, the Sumerian scribes could not say. They could only remember, and hope that their memory, pressed into clay and buried in the earth, would survive long enough for someone to find it, to read it, to wonder what was lost when the Anunnaki made their final war and departed from the world they made.